So welcome to this episode of the Tabletop Battlefield. I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. And today I had an idea that I've kind of been looking at for a while now, and I wanted to see, well, let's just see what happens. Kind of an experimental build process here, where I'm taking an aquarium piece that I bought at the grocery store for 10 bucks, and I want to see how much work it's going to take to make it seem like it actually belongs on the Tabletop Battlefield. So let's get started with the build process. I don't know what it's made of. It's fairly light, but it looks to be some sort of casting. I also don't know how it's painted, and that could cause issues. But what I think I want to start with is just doing some washes. So I'm going to take some Seraphim sepia, and then I'm going to work that into a lot of the kind of recessed areas, just kind of give a little more contrast to this piece. For right now, I'm going to move on to work on the gray bricks. For that, I'm bringing out the Citadel shade, the Known Oil. And this is the normal version, not the gloss version. I'm going to run this, like I said, all throughout all the crevices and details of the gray brick areas on this piece. Let's talk about even more contrast. I'm going to go back and do some dry brushing with, in this case, linen white, which is kind of an off-white color from a Reaper's Master series. And that'll get just a little bit of bright edge to some of the marble areas. So I'm going to do something very similar, and I'm going to be working though on the gray bricks this time, and I'm going to be dry brushing with Dawnstone Gray from Games Workshop's Citadel line of paints. I'm going to take some Beeltan Green, which is a dark green shade from Citadel's line of paints, and go over all the plant areas on this piece. So next step up is going to be to build a base for this piece. We're going to make it out of extruded polystyrene. I got a little bit hiding over here. And this is just so that I'll be able to have a little bit of a texture area surrounding it, and it'll look a little bit nicer than just having the piece just sit right on the tabletop. So taking a Sharpie, I'm going to trace around the base as best I can. Then let's kind of trace out an approximate shape of the final base itself. And once it's cut out, I'm going to cut the thickness of this down in half, because I think the inch thick piece I have here is too thick for the base. So about a ½ inch thick is what I want to go for. Well, there's a bit of a fail on my part. So what I knew from the start, what I wanted to do was trace around on the top side, and then make this flat side be the bottom of the terrain piece, because I knew I was going to cut it in half. Of course, if I trace it around and it fits good like this, and then I flip it over, I've now got a mirror image of the cutout and not the actual thing down here, and that's causing problems. Fortunately, it's extruded polystyrene. Let's just kind of jam it in there. Okay, I gotta do a little bit of modifications, but not a lot. All right, there we go. Let's sculpt this base and make it look a little bit more interesting. What I don't have at the moment is some sort of gesso paint or some sort of other special paint that will work well in the extruded polystyrene. You generally can't use normal acrylic paints, they just don't coat very well. So what I'm going to do is put a nice layer of just PVA glue, in this case Elmer's glue, but anything will work. Just going to coat the entire piece of extruded polystyrene, let it dry, and then I'll give a good, nice coat for the paint to bind to. Let's let this dry for a while, then I'll move on to building the rest of the base. The glue is dry on the styrofoam here, and the rule number one of YouTube video tutorials is when you say you gotta do something, you wanna make sure you have the proper supplies to do that, and I kinda just screwed that up. Because I put the glue on the styrofoam here because I said, well, I don't have any paints that work well in foam. And I dug this stuff up here. This is Earth Undercoat from Woodland Scenics. Let me read from the bottle. Specifically formulated for adding color to plaster, cloth, flex paste, foam, wood, plaster, and paper mache terrain models. So apparently I did have some really good foam paint, I just didn't know it. Alright, so let's apply this all over my base here for the terrain piece. So clearly I'm really bad at this whole not knowing what I have thing. I just dug up 3 more bottles of this Woodland Scenic stuff that all reads it's good for foam. Well, this layer here is starting to dry a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and just start mixing in some other colors. I have a green undercoat, I have a yellow ochre, as well as a slate gray. And I'm going to be using these things to get a little bit of a different color going on with the base here. I'm going to wait a little bit for all the paint to dry before I apply some of the slate gray color to get a little bit of a darker shade in some of the recessed areas. But in the meantime, I'm going to apply some rocks. So for the rocks, I've got some crushed seashells. You've seen me use these before in some of the basing things. So I'm going to apply several of these to this base to give a little bit more of an interesting texture. So what I'm going to work on next is get some kind of vines and things growing up the columns here. And for that I've got 2 different types of fine turf and 1 type of clump foliage. Thank you, The Simpsons, for learning how to pronounce that one. And I probably should do this right. So for that we're going to use some hobby tack. So this is a type of adhesive glue from Woodland Scenics. It's designed to attach stuff like the foliage and fine turf and all that things. You basically just paint it on to your model. And yeah, it's a little brush in the bottle. And you gotta wait a few minutes. And eventually it turns from kind of white to semi-clear and tacky. And then when that happens, you can start applying things. So what I'm gonna do is just trace out some lines of where I want the vines and moss to be growing up. This video allows us to jump ahead a little bit. The glue is already tacky, and it's time to start putting on some of the turf and other details. Now to add some volume, this is where the clump foliage is going to come in. It looks a lot better if you only put just tiny little pieces on instead of large things. This is meant to be more of like a climbing plant and not like a, you know, a bush or a tree or something. So that's looking up pretty good. We got some nice vines growing up all over the place. I want to add some highlights to the vines using some fine turf that is a lighter green color than everything else that's currently on the terrain piece, so it will stand out a little bit. I think what I'm going to do is water down some white glue and carefully apply that on the areas where I want to have this particular color. I think the building portion of this is done, so let's set this piece aside and go back to the base and finish that one up. Oddly enough, it's not fully dry. It's been like 25 minutes, but it should be good enough to work with. So I'm going to start with some slate gray. Focus a lot on the rocks, but also just the base in general. Probably the best way to use this is to build up some areas of color to make it look like they're larger areas of rock. I got some pretty standard brown acrylic paint this time. I'm going to be using a dry brush to apply some of that over large areas of the base. Now the layer of the dirt color is done, we're going to go back and work on the rocks a bit more. I'm going to focus more along the cliff edge or base edge rocks that I started painting earlier. Let's take advantage of the wet paint and start applying some flocking. Of course, I gotta do this very carefully or I'll really mess things up. But I really just want to avoid the rocks, both the seashells as well as the areas around the edge. From earlier, I've also got my green grass color. This is a little bit of the lighter green color. I'm going to spread some of this around as well. A little bit of Citadel sand. This is just small little sand pebbles from Games Workshop's line of hobby supplies, if they still make this stuff, because that's freaking old. Just going to put a little bit of, oh, that's a little too much. I'm just going to put a little bit of this around the rocks. Now we're going to move on to some heavier flocking and debris, and for that we're going to pull out the hobby tack glue. I'm going to put some of this down in a few areas where I want things like bushes to be, or some kind of wood debris or things like that. You know what would be fun to stick here too? How about a big tree? Let's go with Bob Ross in this thing. Wait a few minutes for the hobby tack to become tacky. That's what it's called, and imagine that's probably a very intentional thing. And we'll finish up some of the details of this base. As I did before, we're going to apply a very small amount of the lighter green flocking on top of all the bushes. Now we have one more patch of glue to do something with over here. And that is where we're going to use some of these crushed tree bark pieces that I used back when I did the blender modeling of a tree stand. I'll put a link to that video in the description of this one. Why that tree is there, I have no freaking clue, but it's cool looking. It's a nice big tree. And to drive tabletop game players nuts, because now we can argue whether this is covering terrain or whether it's open terrain. The Tabletop Battlefield, ticking off tournament game players since 2007. I want to apply a little bit more color into the rocks. That's pretty much going to be about it. So I'm taking some Dawnstone Gray from Games Workshop's Citadel line of paints, and we're going to dry brush it across the rocks. I'm going to take some non-oil shade. This is the non-gloss version, and we're going to put it all over those rocks. Geez. In a story of total failure, I went to wash my brush off, but instead of putting it in the pot of water, I put it in the pot of flocking. Okay, I knocked the tree over doing some emergency repairs here. I just used the old paintbrush, old artificial layer paintbrush, to create a nice big hole in the base right there. Then in goes some super glue, which will probably melt the styrofoam a little bit, but that's all right. I'm not really that worried about it. And then if I did things right, we'll really just jam that tree down in there. That'll solve that problem. Let's put this thing more or less back in where I think it should be. I'm probably going to lose a few bushes in the process, but that's perfectly fine. And there we go. You know, it don't look too bad. Let's hold that up and compare. There's our final piece. We can compare it to the beginning and call this project done. So once again, thank you guys all for watching. Once again, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. And this is just a fun experiment. I always wanted to try this, where it took, like I said, some cheap, relatively cheap aquarium stuff pieces and see what I could do in terms of making it look like it belongs on a Tabletop Battlefield. And frankly, it's not a half bad job, especially for the fact that this thing here only cost $10. So go ahead and subscribe to this YouTube channel to get other random build projects like this, some costume stuff, robotics, and who knows what other things I've got planning coming up this summer. Maybe 3D printing from some historical artifacts. I've been thinking about doing that for some other costume stuff. It'd be kind of fun to take a shot at it. So maybe I'll be doing that later. But until then, thanks for watching and have a great week.